Hi, Eunice.
Hello.
Eunice, just to check with you, we keep the video off all the time, don't we? It's
No, you can present with the video on.
okay. Hi, Irina.
Welcome all. While we're waiting for this chemicals network discussion to start, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat room. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a chat function. And if you can please go in there and introduce yourself, and we'll be starting at the top of the hour. Thank you. Welcome if you're just joining us. We are going to start shortly. I do ask that you keep your videos and your mics muted unless you're presenting. And please do introduce yourself with your name, country, and organization in the chat. Also to get familiar with the chat, because this is where the discussion will be taking place. Thank you for those of you who are introducing yourselves already. If you can't find the chat function, it's straight at the bottom of the Zoom. You'll see it says chat. And if you click on that, you'll see that people are introducing themselves already. And we'll get started in a couple of minutes. If you haven't registered for the chemicals network discussion, Eunice will be posting the link for signing up. Please do register so that you get information for the future discussions. We also have a chemicals network newsletter. If you would like to receive the newsletter that is linked to the discussions and provides much more information, the link is also provided for you in the chat and you can join. And we'll start in a minute. Please do continue to introduce yourselves. Thank you. Right, so it's the top of the hour and we will begin now this discussion. So welcome to all of you to the first discussion of 2022 for this chemicals network that is run by the University of Cape Town in South Africa with support from Sweden through the Swedish Chemical Agency. I'm Professor Andrea Rother. I'm head of the Environmental Health Division at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Please do continue to introduce yourselves. It's nice to see where you're from. Please make sure you put in your name, country, and organization. Just to remind you, or for those of you who are new, this is not a webinar. Rather, this is a discussion forum where we discuss various issues related around chemicals management and see how we can work together to move towards a toxic-free future. both for human health and for the environment. And you will see that today's discussion, we're focusing on mercury. Specifically, we're looking at the safe handling of mercury as hazardous substance and waste since the Minamata Convention has entered in force. And we're very fortunate to have two speakers today who are going to take us through this discussion. Before we do, just to remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your videos off. We will have a verbal presentation from the presenters. We will then move into the chat room and type our questions and comments. There will be polls on Mentimeter. You'll receive the link. If you have a second device, it's a good idea to use that. And we encourage you to ask questions and to be very interactive. With this new virtual technology and everyone becoming so familiar with it, it's more and more, we're more and more able to have these kind of virtual discussions and not just a webinar. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our two speakers. First, I'll introduce to you Irena Talamoni, who is an industrial engineer. She has over 14 years of field experience with hazardous waste. And since 2007, she has worked as a technical officer at the Hazardous Waste Coordination Ministry in the Ministry of Environment in Argentina. And in this position, she has been looking at applications for authorization of hazardous waste disposal plants and the management systems of hazardous waste and generators. You are most welcome, Irena, and thank you for giving of your time. Our second speaker will be Rico Euripido, who has a master's of science and has worked for over 20 years on mercury, as well as other chemicals and other issues. And he currently works for Groundwork and Friends of the Earth South Africa as a campaign coordinator, supporting campaign staff in the strategic alignment of Groundwork's 6 different campaigns. And his interests really lie with chemicals and energy policy, climate change, and public health. And Rico is also an environmental epidemiologist. Rico, you're most welcome. So I'm now going to hand over, Rico, I'll invite you to turn on your video and your microphone to take us through the introduction before we move to question 1. Rico.
Thanks, Andrea. I think Irena will do the introduction and I'll do the background to question 1.
Okay, my apologies. I was looking at the discussion guide. My apologies. Irena, over to you.
Hi, good morning and good evening to all. Thank you, Andrea. Can you see me? Because I have my screen divided in 2, so I don't know if you can see me.
We can see and hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you all. Well, first of all, I want to present myself. I'm Irina, and first I would like to thank the host for the invitation to this forum as a presenter. This is my first time as a presenter, so please be patient with me. Today, we're going to discuss a very important topic related with the safe handling of mercury, but putting the focus on interest on mercury wastes. As we know, the Minamata Convention of Mercury is a global treaty to protect human health and environment from the adverse effects of mercury. Major highlights of Minamata Convention includes the phase out and phase down of mercury use in a number of products and processes. Having in mind the end of the pipe, all these will become a waste anytime and will have to be disposed. The convention also addressed interim storage of mercury other than waste, site contaminated with mercury, some management of mercury waste, as well as other environmental issues. Next, please. Can we please move to the next? Okay, slide. Since Minamata Convention was adopted, parties have the obligation on environmental zone management on wasted covered under Article 11, or the wastes that are defined as mercury waste. In general, countries have regulations for hazardous waste, including the mercury waste in this kind of regulations. Depending on that, each country, the implementation of the environmental zone management of wastes defined as mercury waste under the convention will be a great challenge, which often includes lack of regulation or overlapping of regulations between different sectors that regulates, for example, health and safety issues at work, hazardous waste, mining regulations on the other side, that maybe they are overlapping the same stuff to regulate. The overlap in that kind of things is just critical as the lack of regulations, since many times different control authorities converge on the same object of control, and the circumstance creates confusion between the stakeholders. For example, high concentration of mercury could be intended as a product or as a waste, according to the technical specification of the mercury, but depends this legal condition of the destination, if it goes for an allowed use or it goes for disposal. For example, there is a kind of overlapping when, for example, mercury obtained as a byproduct in the mining sector could be intended to sell it in the market as to an allowed use, or the owner can decide to dispose it. It's important to highlight that today it is pending under the Minamata Convention the definition on mercury contaminated waste. So, because there is not a threshold yet adopted. The next, please. As we say, parties have the obligation to manage in a safe way a wide range of mercury waste. Recovered mercury is the most enigmatic one. Why? Because it could be or not a waste, depending on the decision of the owner. We're talking about recovered mercury as a byproduct in unfair mining, recovered from phase out of products, from waste treatment facilities, for example, the treatment of extracted soil from a contaminated site, from discontinued process that use mercury as an income, and stockpiles. In general, it is pure mercury. On the other hand, some products could be intended to be used in an allowed use or to be disposed. Depending on that, the labeling and the storage condition often change. For phase out of mercury containing products, non-thresholds I need to according to the decision of the parties. So there will be waste products in a large range of mercury containing concentration. Since very small mercury compounds have some kind of products, for example, vaccine of drugs, and others have more mercury like a thermometer. So elemental mercury have inside, and different is the technology for disposal between them. Well, this is the end of the introduction, and now I think we have to pass to the next slide that is Rico's in charge.
Thank you very much, Irena. Rico, over to you.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Irena, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody that's joining, depending on where you are. So as we've heard, mercury waste can come in these variety of forms, depending on the source. We've heard that they can be industrial processes that use mercury, that create waste from both manufacturing and pollution control, such as sludges and spent catalysts. We've heard that mercury added products can become waste when they're discarded. This is typically at the end of their useful life. We know in our jurisdiction in Africa, we are a net importer of mercury added products. There's very, very little manufacturing of mercury added products in our region. However, we use a lot of mercury added products, especially batteries and lighting and medical equipment, for example. But products can also become wastes if the products can't be sold legally or if they lack a market, either due to consumer preference. So for example, as more people will choose energy efficient lighting such as LEDs that don't have mercury in them and replace lights like CFLs, for example, those products will also eventually become waste and enter into the waste stream. Now, the convention anticipates mercury becoming waste as a consequence of the provisions, the other provisions in the convention that restrict global supply and also global trade. So Article 3 of the convention, and between Articles 4 and 7, they are intended to reduce the supply and trade of mercury, as well as reduce the global demand of mercury. So in the convention, Article 11 is the provision of the convention that addresses these mercury wastes, and its implementation will eventually result in the final disposal of these as they will become hazardous wastes. Now, the convention is mutually supportive of other multilateral agreements, such as the Basel Convention, and it's also complementary in the sense that it tries to address this mercury waste issue. And at the core of this article, of Article 11, is the focus on environmentally sound management of mercury waste and the control over its transboundary movements. The convention aspires to both improper management of waste at the domestic level and unwanted mercury waste dumping among nations. So if we go to the next slide, these are the examples of the products already under Annex A of the convention that have to be phased out as mercury added products after 2020. So they are most batteries, most measuring devices that we find in healthcare, most switches and relays that use mercury as the conductor of electricity, some lamps, these are the CFLs, and some linear lamps and some halogen lamps, pesticides, biocides, and topical antiseptics, and also these mercury, the mercury added to skin lightening creams above the threshold of 1 ppm. So many countries, especially low middle income countries, will still have these legacy products in their countries. And as the convention is implemented progressively across countries, many of these products that are now banned or are obligated to be phased out will still find their way into the market. So if we go to the next question, that's the background to the first question. This is my question to the group. In your countries now, considering what you have heard, what are the barriers or opportunities to meet the requirements of Article 11 of the Minamata Convention on Mercury? Are you able to domesticate and to begin to practically implement this idea of environmentally sound management of mercury waste and the control over its transboundary movement, especially in products? That's my question.
Thank you, Rico. Thanks very much for very succinctly and quickly setting the stage for the discussion on the background and backdrop of Irena's introduction. So we're going to move into the chat. You'll see the question is being posted there by Eunice as well. if you can find your way into the chat room. If you are unsure about the situation in your country, or you have a question for Irena and Rico, you can also post that in the chat. Rico, you are welcome to stay on if you want to speak to the comments that you see in the chat. Sometimes it makes it a bit easier. So the chat function is at the bottom, and we'll see you all there for question 1.
Thanks, Andrea. That's a good first question to start us off. Under the Minamata Convention, many countries, especially in low middle income jurisdictions around the world, were given the opportunity to apply for funding to undertake what were called Minamata Initial Assessments, MIAs for short. And the MIAs essentially were a vehicle for countries to get some money, some seed money, to undertake a baseline assessment of where the mercury is in their countries. So one approach to this was to develop an inventory, a system to model and to estimate how much mercury might occur in the countries undertaking the MIAs, using an Excel spreadsheet that allowed the ease of modeling and guessing, accurately guessing the amount of mercury for particular under the different thematic areas of the convention. So under products, if a country could estimate the amount of thermometers that they imported every year, the amount of batteries that they imported and what kinds of batteries they were, this level, it's called a level 2 inventory that was developed by UNEP. This level 2 inventory allowed countries to estimate how much mercury might be contained in these products. And some initial information from the African region showed that products were very important as far as importing mercury into your country was concerned. So countries would import the products that they needed. The inventory allowed them to estimate the amount of mercury, and it generally was significant, the amount of mercury being imported into especially African countries. I had the opportunity to work with 5 African countries to help them develop their baseline assessments, their MIAs. And in all of those 5 countries, regardless of how big or how small they were and how big or how small their economies were, at least 5 tons of mercury in their national inventories was as a result of mercury in products. And we all know in low middle income countries, and especially in Africa, we have very few what we define as sanitary landfill sites that are lined and monitored regularly, and that many of these products, when they ended up as waste, would just end up into the environment. And not only that, they would end up into the environment and be subject to open burning, because open burning is a very common waste management practice in our region. And through open burning, we were also able to estimate how much of that mercury might get into the environment. And that is also quite significant, because it's not just the mercury released from open burning, but also other problems such as POPs, subsequent lead and cadmium contamination as a result of some of these products, the impact on the receiving environment, especially water and food. So domestic animals are quite commonly found, you know, in waste sites. And if people are exposed to that kind of contamination, it could become exponential quite quickly. Great. I see a comment from our Zambian colleagues. And many of these products are in interim storage, awaiting safe disposal. That's very interesting. So how do you collect those products? So say batteries or lights or lamps come to the end of their life. Do you have a collection scheme to take them back? Who stores them? How are they stored? Are they stored in containers that might prevent leakage into the environment?
Sorry, Rico, I hope that didn't throw you, but there's a poll question now on the screen. So we're asking people to click on the link in the chat. That will take you into Mentimeter, and you can respond to the question if your country has legislated any laws or policies in this respect. And there, Rico, you're more than welcome to continue responding to questions. There are a few more in the chat.
Thank you. I see an interesting question from Iran. That a siloed approach, especially in government and lack of coordination, adds some restrictions in environmentally sound management of waste. I would like to draw your attention particularly to some of my experiences, and that is that many of our environmental laws and legislation and policies are intended to protect people's health, to protect public health. And yet it is our environmental directorates and our environmental professionals who are responsible for overseeing and implementing many of these laws and regulations. But sometimes they are delinked from our ministries of health, and our ministries of health should also play more of a role in environmental governance, environmental oversight, and also more of a role in articulating the impacts, the health impacts of some of these environmental determinants of disease, for lack of a better phrase. So that is definitely something that I think we should think very carefully about, is how much coordination is there between our health ministries and our environmental ministries, and by extension also, you know, with ministries that are mandated with very different portfolios, such as energy and energy production. We need to align all of that so that we understand the costs and the benefits of the different approaches that we choose in our countries. Just as a general comment. The comment about science and the barriers between the science and the policy interface is also an important issue that we need to address. In fact, at UNEA, which is starting in a week's time, this is UNEA 5.0, 2, which is beginning in Nairobi, it is one of the resolutions that has been tabled by a cluster of countries. And that is that the science policy interface needs to be better articulated and better understood by countries in order that that our policies and our environmental regulations and our actions are informed by the most recent science, and that we choose these science-informed approaches.
Thanks, Rico. I don't know if you want to, there are quite a few comments that are coming through. I don't know if you want to pick a few more before we wrap up this discussion. And I don't know if you'd like to comment on the poll on the screen as well. And for those of you who haven't voted, you can go to menti.com and put in the code at the top, or you can use the link that's in the chat.
Yeah.
Rico, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks. So if we look at the poll and just a quick interpretation of the poll. So approximately half of the respondents said that yes, there were laws in their countries, and approximately the other half said either no or they don't know. Now, the Minamata Convention on Mercury has been ratified by over 130 countries, at least at the last count. Not just signed, but also ratified. And the requirement is that once ratified, it should be domesticated into national laws. And that is a challenge that many countries still face. We have these great policies and these great laws, but implementing them at the local level is still a challenge. And you know, in the NGO sector, what we encourage and what we try to do as often as we can is have a top-down approach to work with national government and to try and work with them and help them to implement these laws and policies, but also a bottom-up approach. So, for example, where hospitals are still using mercury-added products, to work with those hospitals so that they also, from a bottom-up approach, you know, stop procuring mercury-added products that are meant to be limited under the convention. So, I think that is an important consideration, that countries should by now begin to domesticate these international conventions, and that there should be a top-down and also a bottom-up approach. It also seems from the comments that there's a lot of scope for awareness raising, that awareness around mercury-added products is important, awareness to restrict the trade and the use of them are also important. So we should also think about that in our work.
Thank you, Rico. Did you want to make another comment?
Just to acknowledge that artisanal small-scale gold mining is a very tricky area of the convention to try and implement, because it's so diverse across in all the jurisdictions of the world. At the moment, people, you know, the best way to describe it is that the biggest gold rush that the world has ever seen is actually happening now. And it's not a gold rush in the traditional sense of, you know, people rushing off to one country. It's happening in over 70 countries around the world. It's mostly informal. It mostly includes vulnerable people like women and children. People who engage in artisanal small-scale gold mining do so because the return for their labor is so high. They get a good price for the gold because the price of gold is so high. So artisanal small-scale gold mining is diverse. It's happening in many places. It's very difficult to regulate and to oversee. There are national action plans. There is a way in the convention to help countries make sense of what's happening in their countries and to work with artisanal miners to reduce their exposure, to encourage them not to use mercury and to use substitutes to mercury. And for those of you that are engaged in work around artisanal small-scale gold mining, I encourage you to go to the UNEP Mercury Partnership website, where very, very good resources exist to develop public health strategies, to demonstrate alternatives to using mercury, to demonstrating best practices, etc. And I'll look for the URL and I'll post it in the chat in a minute.
Thanks, Rico. And I think you are concluding question 1 on a very important note. I mean, the chat has really highlighted different issues and different barriers in relation to, that legislation exists or regulations exist, but there's no enforcement, or perhaps even people are talking about lack of awareness. But what you highlighted with your final comments is the fact that if we want to truly remove mercury and remove it from the system, from our countries, we need to also talk about alternative economic livelihoods. So how does one incorporate that in terms of the fact that people are actually making a living based on many aspects of mercury being in products or using mercury? And what alternatives are we then offering for these livelihoods? So I think that also needs to be very much a part of the conversation as well. All right, so I assume no more final comments from you, Rico. Then I will move over to Irena to take us through to question 2. And thank you again, Rico, for setting the stage nicely. So Irena, you're welcome to, if you want to turn your video on, and you can take us through the introduction of question 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, now we're gonna talk about mercury storage. Elemental mercury can be recovered or obtained as a first-hand, I would say, from the mining sector, primary or as a secondary or as a byproduct in the, for example, gold extracting activities as a byproduct. So, because of Minamata, Article 11, Article 3, and a lot of articles of the convention, different circumstances involve the mercury, elemental mercury, because could be destined to an allowed use or could be disposed. So in one stage of the management should be stored. The convention apparently have different provision for storage of mercury since it has a specific article that covered the matter. The Article 11 applied to interim storage specifically other than waste and specifies that mercury, as defined in Article 3, I mean up to 95% of concentration of mercury, is under this article provision of storage. On the other hand, Article 11 define mercury waste, and by decision of the Conference of the Parties number 3, specifically decision number 5, established that no thresholds need to be established for mercury falling under subparagraph 2, Article 11, I mean consisting mercury waste. So the decision have a table, adopted a table of kind of mercury. Between that, it is recovered mercury from different sources. The listing in the table means to be, it is a waste. But for example, in the listed, you will find some kind of recovered mercury from waste treatment that maybe it has a very high purity or concentration of mercury. And also the article said that it is possible to use in an unloaded use this mercury. So this is some kind of dichotomy, or it's not a contradiction. It's just a legal status of this mercury recovered, because for one it is a waste, or for others could be an material to use. So the circumstance create a dichotomy between the regulations, also between regulations applying to products and regulation that apply to waste, depending the destination that the owner pretend to the mercury. The next, please. Next slide, please. So the decision to dispose of mercury triggers a lot of issues to solve. The principal one is where and how to dispose it, if it is an option, because dispose and treat elemental mercury waste is not an easy and cheap task. As we know, not all countries have the technology capacity to do it, so we'll need, or it is necessary, to appeal to export and pay the disposal in another country. So economically, maybe the equation is not on the side of the export country. For that, of course, the article contemplates that this transboundary movement should be under the Basel Convention's provisions. But until we decide, or we collect the money to do it, or whatever, the mercury should be storage in an interim way. So storage interim, it is an option. And depending on that, different conditions should change the conditions of the way the mercury should be stored. So, for example, once we define the destination, we will need to determine the expected time of storage, the infrastructure, and special needs for transportation. Because as we know, it is, we said, we have to try to do not repack the mercury. So at the first, it's better to store it in a container that is adequate for transport, but the transport will depend if it goes to an allowed use or to dispose, because the capacity of transportation, the regulation of transport, maybe are not the same if the product goes to an use. So maybe the capacity of the container should be bigger or smaller for this function. The location also will condition the destination, and if it costs, it is, for example, first-hand mining in general. For example, in Argentina, the mining are in a high mountains location that is seismic, for example. So these are all conditions that will change the status of the mercury storage. So the next, please. Here I put some resources or interest web pages to consult this kind of mercury conditions or guidelines to storage. But here the question is, because based on my experience in the hazardous waste divisions in the Ministry of Environment, we have a very problem when we go to control the storage of mercury and the owner don't know if he pretends to sell it for use or to dispose it. So a lot of regulation converge. So my question for you is, what do you think if is a specific regulation needed for mercury storage, regardless if it's destined to use or to dispose of? And if you can, give examples or explain the pros and contrasts of different regulatory approaches. If there are overlaps, if there are overlappings, or lack of, or you think that an integrate regulation specifically for storage of mercury, regardless the status, is needed. I hope you understand my English, first of all. If you have any questions.
Thanks, Irena. And I think you've raised a very important question. So question 2 is posted in the chat, and we're inviting all of you as participants to please respond to question 2, to what Irena has posed to you, and really important questions about different regulations regarding around the storage and use of mercury. Irena, you're more than welcome to stay on and respond to comments and questions rather than having to type. We will have 2 poll questions as well, so to look out for those. Thank you.
Yes, for example, in Argentina, one of the regulations that overlaps with hazardous waste is the mining regulations. And there are 2 authorities that control the mercury in the mining sector. But we have different standards of controls. So this is an issue for us. We go. If we are aware of national approach to storage in our region, no. We're trying to solve the problem into Argentina by a specific regulation, and trying to find the points of contact between all the regulations. For example, the mining, the hazardous waste, and the health and safety at work regulations. And we're trying to do just one to involve only mercury storage. So, but I don't know what the approach in the regions, if they have any other vision on that. Okay.
So we have another poll, and we invite participants to use the Menti link that's in the chat. You can just click on it and it'll take you straight to the poll question. You will be able to read the responses better than you can on your screen. But really looking at, does your country have specific regulation for the storage for mercury for use versus the storage of mercury for disposal? And you can see there's a selection of responses. So we invite you to please vote. Thank you.
I don't know if you have the same problem in your countries, but for example, one is this kind of limbo of the owner when he do not decide what to do with the mercury that possess So who controls it and how or which regulation applies on this situation? Right. Right to change. What do you think are the pros and cons? Oh, Andrea, you asked me what I think that are the pros and cons of not having two different regulations or low and middle income country. Okay, I think the pro could be that more transparency for the stakeholders. What are the authority that will control and what are the conditions to storage waste? Because, for example, as a product, it's not the same. For example, the labeling is different that if it is mercury for disposal. This is just one thing, but a small thing, but creates a difference. The labeling of the container, for example, the need of have a safety data sheet. It is mandatory for a product and not for a waste, for example. So I think if we have just one legislation together for mercury storage, we can fill this loophole. And the cons, I don't know, I can see any cons on that. Maybe there could be different authority or the fight for different authority to control the storage, but I don't know if there is another one. Right. Yes, in the informal sector is more different to approach the issue, but the convention have specific provisions for mercury. And one thing that the next COP will try to decide or will adopt, we hope, is to define that the tailing from small for artisanal mining goes for the specific article of impact. Yes, in general, non-countries have specific regulations for mercury storage. In general, are the general laws or specifically for hazardous waste in general that are very, at least in Argentina, are not specific. So it's a difference. Think another porter or the retailer. Orico, your question, I think is, I can give you an answer because It's a very wide and a very tricky question because depends also on the context of the country. In Argentina, we don't have specific regulations for this kind of responsibility of the producers as some other countries have. And we try to do that with some other hazardous waste. And the first, it could be a good approach that to share the responsibility of take out of the market these products. We have all, but that's important in Argentina. We have restrictions for use of mercury in products. So we don't have a lot of products in circulation that have mercury, but we still have, of course. And one issue is also the end of the life cycle, that it is, we do not have a technology capacity to treat some kind of products at the end of the life. So that's why storage is important, because until we decide what to do with the kind of products, phase out. So we need to store it.
So we have another poll on the screen. And again, you go to menti.com and put the code in, or click on the link that has been provided for you in the chat. And this is an open-ended question. So are there different technical storage conditions in your country, depending on whether the mercury is for use or for storage, for disposal? And when you write your comment, please do put your country in so that we know we can link the response to a country or an organization. That would be great. Thank you.
This is tricky because we have in Argentina different technical storage conditions, and here's the problem that we have. And also not only between different national laws. In Argentina, we had different levels of governance. So you have the national level, the state level, and the local level. And maybe there are different regulations for the storage conditions, depending the location of the where is the mercury stored. So I don't know if it will happen to you. Regulations. mercury in Kenya is legally required to be recycled. Sorry, this is maybe it's interesting to know that. And I mean, when I mean disposal, just one note, I mean, could be any of the disposal operations in the Basel Convention. I call disposal, even final disposal or treatment or recovery or any of the recovery operations covered under disposal. I don't know if it clarifies a little. I mean, when I say in Argentina, we don't have disposal technology, I mean, we don't, for elemental mercury, we can treat it or recover or final disposal, for example, in an engineering landfill.
So Rihanna, I don't know if you want to respond to some of the comments that are coming up, if you can see them on the poll.
Oh, let me see. I'm looking at the poll. Are they different? I'm sorry, I was in the chat. Are there different? Kenya, no, these are still gray. No different technical storage. Oh, and oh, most mercury in, say, I don't know which country it is stabilized as sulfur and goes to the landfill. But I mean, this technology is only applied for some kind of waste, in general with low content of mercury, or stabilization is of elemental mercury is complicated. It's not an easy process. So if it goes to then to a landfill, a controlled landfill, I don't remember exactly if the guidelines say this is an ESM, but in general, I know that then after stabilization goes to, for example, a salt mine, or is on land, or some kind of permanent storage, not directly to the landfill. And drums and dumped, mainly starts out with into the environment. For example, if you want to have as a guide, if you don't have, under Basel Convention now, we are revising the technical guidelines of mercury management, waste management, and that could be used as a reference, for example, to adopt. I don't know if your countries are parts of Basel Conventions, but it's a very interesting tool to use as a guidance. And now it's adapting to Minamata Convention's provisions. So we hope in the next COP or soon we'll adopt the modification.
Would you like to make any concluding comments for question 2 from what you've seen in the chat or on the polls before we move on to question 3?
Okay, no, just as a conclusion, as I can say, storage conditions are not very clear or are not linear, dependent on the country and the destination of the mercury. I see that all talk about mercury for disposal, but I feel it's necessary to think about just about mercury storage conditions, safe storage conditions, and try to use the guidelines to regulate mercury specifically, because it's easy to control if it is well stored. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Yeah, it really is an important issue, and I think often not addressed and discussed enough. So we will now move on to question 3. And Reina, are you taking us through question 3 as well with the introduction? No, we're moving.
No, Rico's.
I'm afraid the document I'm reading from is different. So thank you very much. Rico, I hand back over to you.
Sorry for the confusion.
No problem.
So this question is formulated because for those of us that are involved in Minamata in one way or another, this question is something that is relevant to what's happening now. It's actually in progress. So the way we think about this question informs some of the delegates that are going to be negotiating on our behalfs for our countries. And the way we think about this question is also about how this specific provision gets negotiated as the Minamata Convention comes together for its 4th meeting in person next month in Indonesia. So as part of these provisions and as part of the mandate of the parties to the convention, they are mandated to come together and to negotiate what will become in future thresholds for convention coverage. So experts on waste have been working together in the intersessional process, and they will continue to work together, and they will negotiate what kind of thresholds will apply to different categories of waste. And there are 3 categories in particular that they are mandated with. One is artisanal small-scale gold mine tailings. That's one. The second category is what are called category C wastes. And these are wastes that are contaminated with mercury, such as industrial waste and sewage sludge. And for those countries that have undertaken their Minamata initial assessments, the waste, the mercury content of especially sewage sludge and industrial sludge is quite significant. And it was very surprising for many countries that undertook this baseline assessment. And then the third category is industrial non-ferrous mine tailings. We will only think about and talk about category C waste. And these are waste contaminated with mercury, such as industrial waste and sewage waste. So these so-called category C mercury wastes include a wide variety of basically the stuff that ends up at a wastewater treatment works. In South Africa, in my city where I live in Durban, we often do analytical sampling of the sediments in our harbors to understand what's coming down the wastewater treatment works and it doesn't get treated and ends up in the harbor. We often do it because we want to know what comes through our stormwater drainage and our drainage systems. And we often find high levels of metals and in particular mercury in these sediments, and especially in our sewage sludge and our industrial waste. Now, in many cases, these sludges come out of these wastewater treatment works and they are then managed. They are either spread onto land. In some cases, they are used in agricultural activities. They might be required to be landfilled in a specific way or managed in a specific way, depending on what's inside them. But in our region, especially in the African region, we know that there is a wide variation of our capacity to undertake what the convention requires us to undertake, which is environmentally sound management of mercury contaminated waste in what we would consider, you know, in a global northern context, well-engineered landfill facilities that are double lined and where the water is monitored and the leachate is monitored, etc. Next slide, please. So given this variability in the world, and given that in low middle income countries, human exposure to these category C mercury wastes could occur in a wide variety of exposure settings that we've already talked about before, through either open dumping and open burning, following air dispersion, through people being directly exposed working on landfills. We see people picking waste in many African countries. In South Africa, there's over 100,000 at least waste pickers that work on the streets, that work on landfills. I've seen waste picking in most African countries that I've visited. In many cases, vulnerable populations such as children are often accompanying adults and also picking. We've spoke about land spreading in terms of agricultural practice, using the sludges and the waste as infill. Now, the danger in having variability between the global north and the global south, and having thresholds that don't necessarily protect all populations, is that if your thresholds are set too high, then you will only act on wastes in that respect. It will only catch wastes above a certain threshold. So this brings me to my question, and this is a question that the experts are grappling with, and that is, what should the threshold be? Sorry, one more. Yeah, given this global variability, how should we go about setting waste thresholds, especially for category C waste? And it also relates to how you are able to implement and oversee these laws, or the laws that will be triggered by these thresholds. So how do we think about thresholds? Do we set thresholds very low, so we set the bar very high so that we try and catch as much mercury waste as possible? At the moment on the table is a general threshold of 25 parts per million. That's where the waste expert group have kind of landed at the moment. But at that concentration, it would mean that anything underneath that threshold would not require any kind of management at all. So that's my question to you.
Thanks, Rico. An important discussion to have, particularly for participants and regulators to prepare themselves for future discussions. It'll be interesting to hear what you have to say. And also, you know, the concept of what Rico raised in terms of how will you enforce the threshold. So we'll see you in the chat to discuss, and there will be a couple more polls as well.
And also recalling that in the preamble to the convention is to protect human health and the environment. the intention of the Minamata Convention is that it is a public health convention, and not necessarily an environmental convention.
So while you're thinking about the threshold question that Rico has presented to you, we are also asking you to look at the poll. Again, you can go to mentimeter.com. Should there be one threshold for category C waste? And if so, should it be lower to protect public health in low and middle income countries? And again, to include your country in the response. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. You raise a really interesting question, and this is something that many people who are involved in defining thresholds or trying to understand, how to set thresholds to protect public health should work. So the threshold that's been established by the waste group at the moment is a number that was derived by applying the GHS system of classifying and labeling chemicals. So the expert group used the GHS approach, and they landed on this number of 25 parts per million. Now, some could argue that this number is not going to protect human health, particularly in low middle income countries, because of a whole bunch of different reasons. So one argument could be that GHS is intended to facilitate hazard communication, and it's intended to classify chemicals, and it's intended for labeling requirements. Its intention was never to protect human health in a pure sense. And then the proponents for using a GHS system is that it is the only globally recognized way of setting a threshold, and that it's a global approach, and this is the best thing that we have. So it looks at ecotoxicity of mercury. It might be a little bit iffy on human chronic toxicity, but it might serve as the best thing we have, although it's not entirely fit for purpose. So we have to weigh this all up. We have to think about using these kinds of approaches in terms of what the methodology of how the methodology would apply in a global north and a global south setting, and make the best of that. My inclination is always to err on the side of caution. That the precautionary principle instructs us to do that, to always err on the side of caution. But if it's never going to be practical to be implemented, then how do we reconcile that with a public health approach? I'm not too sure. I can't answer that question. So the idea of having bans and thinking in terms of risk, and depending on the risk and the endpoints, you have different kinds of thresholds. The difficulty with that is that you still need to find a way to place that within the convention, and you need to, and the convention is intended for a global approach to manage mercury. Remember that the reason why the Minamata Convention was agreed in a time of pretty much global unilateralism. There was very little appetite for having a new global treaty, a multilateral treaty at the time. It was pretty much because of the recognition that you cannot control mercury in one country and expect other countries to also be protected and to take measures to protect themselves. So you can have the best laws in Sweden, and you can implement those laws around mercury waste, and you can have the best thresholds and you can catch mercury. But if that mercury gets into the environment from another country and it circulates globally, it will contaminate fish, and those fish will be consumed by Swedish consumers. And for that reason, Sweden alone can't take measures to limit its population exposures to mercury. And that's why we have the convention. One country alone cannot take measures to protect themselves. It has to be a multilateral approach. And only through cooperation will countries be able to hopefully see massive decreases in anthropogenic mercury releases, which will then have an impact on the mercury in the environment.
Thanks, Rico. I don't know if you want to comment on the poll comments before we move on to the next poll.
Yeah, so some people are suggesting that thresholds could be variably introduced, if I'm interpreting that correctly. I'm not too sure that we can have, different thresholds. One possible approach is the way the World Health Organization encourages countries to take action on air pollution. It has different bands and risk kind of categories. So it's a progressive approach to addressing the problem. That might be a possible way of doing that. There's also some appetite, for choosing a lower threshold rather than a higher threshold. Low threshold for general waste, high threshold for healthcare waste management. That's also a variable kind of approach depending on the sector and the usage. Mercury pollution from old mud salvage materials. So, Ahmed, the mercury was very commonly used in industrial activities such as chloralkali plants, chlorine manufacturing plants, for example. When you say old mud salvage materials, I'm not exactly sure what you use, but I'll give you an example of salvage materials that are high in mercury. In a former life, I worked at a poisons unit, and one of the biggest mercury pollution incidents in the United Kingdom was from some children who had found an abandoned scrapyard, a salvage yard. I see old buildings made from earth. Well, mercury is an element. It as an element, it occurs in trace amounts in minerals. So, for example, if you burn a lot of coal in a coal-fired power station, there will be a parts per million component that is made up of mercury. And because you burn a lot of coal, the release is significant over time. Generally, if it's just using natural resources such as earth, such as mud, I don't think the mercury content will be high. But coming back to that salvage story, in the past, cars or scrap cars use mercury in different ways. They use mercury as part of their switches, as part of their light switches, etc. So you do find a lot of mercury in old products, especially old products used that conduct electricity, that have a switch. You will have that. I see, yeah, there's a lot of comments on having a tiered approach with different thresholds and interim thresholds. Yeah, that might be a way to do it. And then there's the opposite of that, which says that, no, we should have thresholds set by public health intergovernmental organizations such as the World Health Organization. And then, yeah, there's a comment about mercury, mercury trade and mercury moving across porous borders, especially in our region in Africa. There are very porous borders. I know in the Latin American region, mercury flows freely across borders. So, yeah, that's also a big consideration. I must say, looking at the poll, I'm not a big fan on having variability especially in global approaches to control substances of global concern. The convention is quite nuanced in that it aims to control mercury in many different ways. And as I said previously, by restricting supply and trade of mercury and phasing out mercury added products in a phased approach, eventually we will begin to reduce the amount of mercury, in circulation. If you introduce variability into that kind of model, then what might happen is that where the market allows a bit of freedom, and where the market allows mercury to circulate, then you will find that will happen. And to give you an example, one of the first provisions of the convention was to say that primary mining of mercury must be eliminated as a practice as early as possible. And countries agreed that there would be a grace period leading up to that, to allow those countries that still had primary mining of mercury as an economic activity to give them the time to address that industry and to allow a transition, a just transition, and to find workers alternative employment, etc. But what happened was that countries where no primary mining was occurring, all of a sudden, primary mining started happening in those countries, and that wasn't ideal in the convention. So all of a sudden, there was primary mining in Mexico, and introducing new mercury from primary mining into the global system. And that wasn't ideal. It wasn't an ideal scenario. Yeah. Great. Yeah, I see a lot of good comments in the poll. Most of them are kind of converging that there should be a single threshold, and that threshold should be a threshold that is protective of public health. And I agree with that.
Thanks, Rico. Would you or Irena like to make any concluding comments before we wind up this very important and very vibrant discussion?
The only concluding comment I'll make is to encourage you all to interact with your Minamata Convention focal points in your countries. They will soon be going off to Indonesia to negotiate in this respect. The African region has tabled a very important amendment to Annex A to include additional mercury added products to be phased out and to be regulated under Annex A. And I encourage all of you to support the Africans in that respect. Thank you. Over to you, Irena.
Irena, did you want to make any last concluding statements before I close this session?
Oh, thank you. No, I think that Rico's point is very interesting because I was following the discussion very intensively because I integrate the expert working group that is working the threshold. So it's very interesting, the comments that all the people put in the chat. And on the other side, talking about the mercury storage that I talked, as a conclusion, I can say that I think there are a lot of issues to solve about Article 11 compliance. So I think, as someone told me in a course I take at the Chemi, it's important to eat the elephant in pieces. So it's important to take each part of the problem in front of the problem and pick one, just one, and start to work and make the difference with that. And then start the second one and then so on. So each country should put the eyes in the most, I don't know, is reality in the country is different. So start at least for one problem to solve. Thanks.
Thank you, Irena, for that concluding statement, and also Rico for yours. So firstly, I'd like to thank both of you for the time that you've taken out of your busy schedules to take us all through a very important topic, and also to really debate and think about it. And I thank all the participants as well for your comments and your questions. And we're hoping through these discussions in the communities of practice that it will impact on your work, some of you on your studies, and perhaps even some of the guidelines, conventions that come later down the line. So thank you again for your input. Thank you to Eunice from UCT in the background for making a smooth running discussion. If you haven't joined the Chemical Network discussion forum yet, the link has been posted for you in the chat. We will be having a next discussion on the 5th of April, which will be looking at the transfer of information in relation to the import of chemicals. Also, if you would like to receive our newsletters, for example, Sylvie just posted an OECD conference meeting that's coming up, and we will post that in the newsletter as well. And lastly, there will be a summary digest coming out from this discussion so that you can use it and share it with your colleagues, perhaps, who were unable to attend. So thanks again to all of you and to our presenters. I wish you a good rest of your day and stay safe. Bye from UCT and Chemie.